Hello and welcome to Church in Maine, the podcast that is at the intersection of faith and modern life. My name is Dennis Sanders. I'm your host, and welcome to episode 150. So I want to take you back and share two stories of two meetings that took place in my denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And one of those took place in the late 1990s, and the other one took place about 2019, so about 4 years ago. Like a lot of mainline Protestant denominations, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ really wrestled with the whole issue of the role of LGBTQ persons in the life of the church. And I think that was very common in disciples of that time period, was to really come together and kind of debate, and not debate is probably not, it's too strong a word, but at least to talk about the issue. What is it that we believe? And I remember watching a video, and it was a video with two Bible scholars from each side of the issue. And they came together, and these were people who worked together to kind of working out their respective viewpoints, and came together and they shared what they believed. And there was kind of a lot of discussion about this. There was even, I remember the denomination even put out resources for congregations to really kind of wrestle with this, the issue. Now, personally, I think that was a good thing. This is an issue that is a very personal issue for a lot of reasons. And it was important for us as a church and as followers of Jesus Christ to really figure out, what is it that we think about this issue? What does the Bible say about this? And how should Christians act when you're dealing with this issue? Now, there are a lot of people who don't think that really you want to talk about this issue, at least, and some of their reasons are reasonable, because of course it is a personal issue, and especially for people who are LGBTQ, it can feel that people are discussing people's lives, and in a way they are. And so that's kind of where we were in the late 1990s. In 2019, the denomination, there was a resolution that was put forward, and this is a non-binding resolution, but it was just talking about the role of the church, the denomination, in welcoming transgender persons into the life of the church. And it was approved, and that's a good thing. But it was also something that was a little bothersome, in that there was no debate, no real talk about things, no wondering what does this mean for us as Christians? What does it mean to be, as kind of the scripture says, male and female? What does that mean when you're talking about that with transgender individuals? We didn't really discuss what it meant and how do Christians respond and react and think about this issue. And actually, that's what I'm trying to get at, is that we weren't really doing a whole lot of thinking about, what does this all mean? And that seems to be an issue throughout American Christianity this day, whether it is progressive or conservative, but there isn't a whole lot of thinking going on. There seems to be a lot of reacting and a lot of following kind of what are the political or winds of the day, but there isn't very, very much thinking about, what does this mean as a Christian? And thinking as a Christian doesn't mean that we all come up with the same answer, but it does mean that we think about, what does it mean as people who follow Jesus? How do we think on this issue? Our guest today is David Watson. He is the Dean of Academic Affairs at United Theological Seminary in Ohio, in Dayton, Ohio. And I have to stress, because it's another United Theological Seminary here in the Twin Cities, and it is not that one, but a seminary in Ohio. And he wrote an article a few months ago in Firebrand magazine about what it means to think. What does it mean to think as a Christian? And it's also available on the Firebrand podcast. And so I do hope that you will take some time. Either there will be links in the description for the article and also for the podcast itself. But the article was named "The Cultivation of the Christian Mind," and in that Watson bases his article on a book by the author and a protege of C.S. Lewis, Harry Baumeister, from the book "The Christian Mind." And actually, I have this book. I've been reading it. A friend of mine suggested reading it, so I have. And he talks about, his whole point is about what does it mean to think Christianly? And this is something that Baumeister says in the book. And this is from page 44. To think secularly is to think within a frame of reference bounded by the limits of our life on earth. It is to keep one's calculations rooted in this worldly criteria. To think Christianly is to accept all things with the mind as related, directly or indirectly, to man's eternal destiny as the redeemed and chosen child of God. So in this episode, I will be talking to David Watson about why is it that as Christians we aren't thinking Christianly anymore? And how can we do that again? This is the second time that David is on the podcast. He was here last year. And a little bit about who he is. He is an elder in, as I said, actually, I should begin that he is the academic dean and vice president for academic affairs at United Theological Seminary, also a professor in New Testament. He teaches courses at United in New Testament, Greek, also courses on church renewal and Bible, and courses in the Bible and disability. He is, as I said, also an ordained elder in the Global Methodist Church. Before that, he was an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. His most recent book is Scripture and the Life of God, While the Bible Matters Today More Than Ever, and that is put out by Seedbed. He is the lead editor at Firebrand magazine, and also one of the hosts of the Firebrand podcast. And we will be talking about what it means in this day and age for Christians to actually think. With that, let's hear from Dr. David Watson. Well, David, thank you for coming back on to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be on, Dennis. And as you know, as I was just saying before we started recording, I really appreciate your voice and your commitment to open dialogue. I appreciate the way that you comport yourself in the public square, and I think we share some of those kind of old school liberal commitments in that way.
Yeah, I worry, as we were talking, that that commitment to liberalism, in that kind of classical sense, is
right
dying out. And that's worrisome for our culture, I think, in general.
It is worrisome because what's the alternative, right? The alternative is a kind of moral absolutism that I don't see I don't see a good outcome to that if it's played out to its logical extremes.
No, I mean, I think that there's a reason that the Enlightenment, I mean, the Enlightenment pretty much came out of the whole 30 Years' War, Treaty of Westphalia, you know, wars, famine, things like that don't really, they're bad. And
Yeah.
there were reasons why we thought maybe we don't want to do that anymore.
Right.
And I think we've forgotten that. We think that we can be this without any cost to it. And um,
I think that's
as
right.
the thing in economics is probably true in life. There's always trade-offs, and we haven't yet as a society understood what the trade-offs are, and the trade-offs are quite immense.
And I think a lot of people, maybe folks who who are skeptical of kind of classical liberalism as an ideology think, well, that's simply a recipe for moral relativism. I don't think that's right, though. I mean, I think you can have strongly held convictions, and I know you do. I
Hmm.
have strongly held convictions. We can respect the convictions of other people, even if we disagree with their convictions. And that's really the only way that we make intellectual progress. And if we want to say moral progress too, we could say that. But I was reading a book by Peter Kraft, who is a Roman Catholic philosopher and apologist. He's written a 4-volume work called Socrates' Children, and it's kind of a layperson's history of philosophy. So I'm reading through this, trying to fill some gaps in my own knowledge. And he talks a little bit about in talking one about the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, he brings up Hegel for some reason. Hegel had this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Okay.
Hmm.
And he said basically that's how all of history proceeds. We have a thesis, we have something pushing back hard against that thesis, but out of that pushback comes something new, a third thing that's neither the thesis nor the antithesis. And Kraft says, that's basically how all people learn all things. In other words, that's how we make intellectual progress. Um, I'm writing a book right now on the history of biblical work in Methodism, and I see that happening actually. You can see that happening across time. And so I think that's right. And I think, I'm not a full bore Hegelian, but I do think on this point he was certainly correct.
So your article, which is in Firebrand magazine, is "The Cultivation of the Christian Mind," and you
Yes.
started off with I think, an interesting sentence or sentences. Theology matters, the Bible matters, Christian praxis matters. I put these words on my tombstone when I'm pushing up daisies. If we do not think like Christians, we will
Yeah.
not act like Christians.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what was the what made you want to write this essay and even to start it off the way that you did?
It's been it's been on my mind for a long time, actually. I've been kind of kicking around these ideas for probably 20 years. At some point I'll actually write a book on this. I don't know my I don't know when I'll get to it, but hopefully before I die. And my students kind of make fun of me because I'm always encouraging them, probably ad nauseum, to think Christianly. Think like Christians. Paul talks about the renewing of the mind, right? And so what that indicates is that there's something wrong with our minds apart from the renewal by the work of the Holy Spirit through Christ.
Hmm.
So if that's the case, if our minds are actually renewed, if somehow sin has affected our minds and makes us think in distorted ways, then there are particular Christian ways of thinking about things, but our first instinct is not normally, even among Christians, my observation, even within myself, so I'm not excluding myself from this. Our first instinct is not to think Christianly. We tend to think pragmatically, and more, I think, we think tribally and we think politically. And so the question is, what are your instincts? Like, have you trained your mind to think in a Christian way, and then how do you do that? So I could go on, but I'll stop there.
And you base this off of a book and actually a student of C.S. Lewis.
Right. Yeah.
And as we said before the podcast, it's a book that a fellow pastor of mine has also lifted up. Could you say a little bit more about that book, which is called The Christian Mind?
Yeah. It's by as you said, a student of C.S. Lewis named Harry Blamires. And he writes in a way that's very similar to C.S.
It
Lewis,
is, yeah.
in the same kind of style. And so in that sense, it's a delight to read. But he talks about it, and this is written in England, an ostensibly Christian country in 1963, certainly far more Christian than it would be today, which actually has a state church still. And he says there is no longer a Christian mind. He's writing primarily about England in his own day, although America bleeds into it sometimes. He says we don't think like Christians about really anything anymore. We think, I mean, an example in the current context is, a lot of church rhetoric has to do with, say, business models. Um, at one time for a long time, I was in a denomination and a document came out. I don't want to throw people under the bus, so I'll just say a document came out that was talking about what we need to do to move the church forward after a long period of decline. Okay, these are the steps we need to take. But the document was almost entirely untheological. If we can just get the right young leaders in there and train them in leadership techniques, if we can just get the right business models in, if we could just get the right techniques for church growth, then maybe we can slow this decline. The idea wasn't even to reverse it. It was just to slow things down. And I thought that's completely unacceptable for a variety of reasons. One, because the solution to any problems in the church, first and foremost, have to be theological solutions. If God is the power behind all that we do in the church, then before we go to pragmatic models or whatever that may mean, we have to go to theological models. We have to think theologically about what we're doing in the life of the church and see where we've gone wrong. But secondly, I just don't accept the narrative that decline in the church is inevitable. There have been ebbs and flows in American Christianity many times. We had the First Great Awakening, we had the Second Great Awakening, and I don't see why it is a resurgence of Christianity is impossible, especially if you believe in God and you believe that God's will is that people will come to Christ and that they'll know Him as their Savior. Why do we expect that the future is inevitably one of decline? I reject that narrative.
How would you define the Christian mind? What does it mean to think Christianly?
So I was reading a book called Biblical Inspiration. Maybe that wasn't the book, but it was a book by I. Howard Marshall. I've been working through his stuff recently, or some of his stuff recently. And he talks about a mind nourished on the gospel. Okay. And I love the way that he puts that, a mind nourished on the gospel. And so, how do we nourish our minds on the gospel? Well, for one thing, as a Methodist, I would say we draw upon the means of grace. And I know that's not unique to Methodism. It's just something that my tradition emphasizes. So we draw upon the means of grace. What does that mean? It means that we consistently pray. We consistently read the Bible. We consistently go to public worship. We fast or abstain from other things in our lives. We conference with other Christians. In other words, we meet for purposes of upbuilding our faith and accountability with other Christians. These are means of grace. We receive the Eucharist. And by doing this, what we're asking is that God will work in our lives and shape our minds in particular ways. Now, I have my opinions certainly about what that looks like, and I'll give an example of that. One of the issues that is about to kick us in the teeth in the North American church is what's called medical aid in dying. Okay. We used to call this assisted suicide, but everything has to be euphemistic now, and so we call it medical aid in dying. And I think the church has to be exceedingly on guard about this, okay? Because the pragmatic approach is to say, well, these people aren't happy, and they're costing the healthcare system money, they're costing their relatives money, they want to die, why shouldn't we kill them? They won't put it in terms those stark, but that's the logic of it. They're suffering, and there's no possible good that can come from suffering. And the merciful thing to do would be to kill them, kind of like we do with our pets. And I want to say, no, that is not a Christian approach. I don't expect non-Christians to think like Christians, let me put it that way. But that is not a Christian approach to human life or to this issue. In Christianity, we believe that human life is inherently valuable, that you can't put a price on it, that suffering can in fact be redemptive, that God is the one who orders the days of our lives. Or like Stanley Hauerwas used to say, Christians, I'll paraphrase, but if Christians are remembered as people who don't kill their young and their old people, we will have done well. So there are a variety of issues, if we're thinking theologically, that should give us pause about medical aid in dying. But the world that doesn't share our outlook, the world that doesn't share our vision of human life, the world that doesn't share our commitment to divine revelation, the world that does not share our theological anthropology is not 100% not going to view things in these ways. I don't expect them to. I expect there's going to be a full court press on this coming probably within the next 10 years. But what scares me is when churches bend the knee on this stuff. That I find completely unacceptable and kind of frightening. Does that give you a good illustration, Dennis, of what I'm talking about? So we just have to think through these Christianly. Under what circumstances is it appropriate for Christians to take human life, if there are any? And how do we apply those criteria in cases where people are, say, terminally ill?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting following that what's been going on, especially in Canada with that law, medical assistance in dying, and how it is. I mean, I think just to put it very bluntly, I think we probably put more safeguards about dealing with our pets than we do with how this law has been treated. It's quite far-ranging.
Yeah, it is. It is, and especially in Western Europe and Canada now, it's really gone quite far.
And I think that there are deep questions on the end of life. Though I think that this law has been used beyond end of life. I mean, it doesn't really even go there. But I think, one of the things that I have a question is, why do you think, and this is, someone else that I've talked to recently wrote an article about this. Why have churches, do you think, as you would have put it, bent the knee on this issue and not challenged it?
I think in particular, Protestants don't have a deep enough theological well in most denominations to deal with this stuff. So the Roman Catholic Church, for example, has a well-established body of doctrine, and they have a well-established body of teaching on the nature of human life. Now, you can agree with them or not agree with them, on these issues, but it's clear where the Roman Catholic Church stands on these matters, and some of their best minds have been engaged in thinking through these issues related to the beginning and end of human life. I don't see many Protestant groups doing that work. I do see individual theologians doing it, and some very fine individual theologians and ethicists doing this kind of work. But with regard to denominations, with regard to particular churches, I really don't see it. We might pass resolutions at our assemblies. We might have short statements in our books of church law about such things. But an issue such as medical aid in dying requires really deep, sensitive, and mature theological reflection. It requires a sustained effort, not just by people, but by churches to say, what is going to be our witness on these matters? I think churches are so worried about losing people now, they don't want to, in at least some churches, they don't want to generate controversy. They're afraid they'll lose people if they take a hard line on these matters. But the bottom line, Dennis, is I think that most of our Protestant denominations, just as churches, have not done the deep work that's necessary.
Do you think that there's been a sort of, for lack of a better word, anti-intellectualism that has taken root among Protestant churches?
Yes. I do think that's right. And I think part of it has to do with the internet. I think some of this is there is so much information out there that is so easily accessible, some of it good, some of it bad, that we don't spend the same time we used to spend in books. And books force your mind to slow down. They force you to think through issues, often in detail. And so, one of the things I noticed in my 20 or so years in theological education is it used to be the case that if we would bring in, say, a big name scholar, you would have a lot of people show up for a public lecture. And that's just not the case now. I mean, you really would have to get a huge rock, like, I don't even know, but people are simply less interested in ideas than they used to be, it seems to me.
One of the things, and this is somewhat related, but I actually read an article. It was strangely just around the time when he died by Tim Keller, called The Passing of Forgiveness.
Yeah.
And he was just basically talking about how our culture has become less willing to have an ethic of forgiveness and what that has, why is that happening? Yeah. And one of the reasons he thinks is because of kind of a culture of the therapeutic, on kind of focusing on the self, which then leads to me to talk about issues on sexuality. And obviously for me, that's been, as a gay man, that's always been obviously a personal issue. But it's always been interesting to talk about that issue because there's always seems to be talk about harm and things to that extent that almost makes really discussing it impossible. And it's interesting for me personally how things have changed. Maybe 20 some years ago in my denomination, the Disciples of Christ, like a lot of mainline Protestant denominations were having kind of discussions on homosexuality. And there was a discussion actually between two people. One, Judith Hoke-Ray, who is a Bible scholar and a lesbian, and Doug Skinner came kind of from an evangelical background and a pastor, theologian as well. And basically how they talked was really to discuss with each other. And I've since become good friends with Doug, and we've talked a lot about how Judith always wanted to enter into discussions in the Bible. Let's have a Bible discussion. Let's enter into what Scripture is talking about. They really had a discussion about this.
Yeah, sure.
And and this whole issue, I mean, it was welcoming. And the funny thing is, I think that actually helped Doug change his mind on the issue, but it wasn't from, just kind of someone beating them over the head, but actually engaging with someone that he didn't initially agree with. Fast forward to a few years ago, I was at our last General Assembly. We had a resolution that was kind of talking about transgender issues. I totally understand that. I think it's, again, an important issue, but there was no discussion. It just kind of sailed through.
Yeah.
And it bothered me. But I fear I'm kind of this weird unicorn in that other people would say, well, we just don't need to have discussion because, well, this is obvious. And it's like, really? I mean, we do need to. I mean, how are we dealing with this? I mean, because again, how I came to my own acceptance of my own sexuality was through the Bible. And it was through digging into the Bible, looking into it, really studying, understanding it. And I feel like too much today is, well, if I agree with this in the larger culture, then we should just go ahead and do this. And it feels like that's not helpful. And I know that there are people that will say that, well, there are people who are being hurt if we don't do this. And I understand that to a point, but I also feel that as Christians, we're not doing due diligence if we don't really wrestle with the issue and help people to work through this. And maybe not everyone will agree, but it feels like we're not doing what it means to be church.
I think to start out with the ethic, with regard to your question, Dennis, the ethic of forgiveness has fallen on hard times. Then again, I'm not sure that's ever been that. Let me just say, I think that's always been one of the more challenging aspects of the Christian life, to forgive, to love your enemies. I don't think you can do that apart from the sanctifying work of the Holy Spirit. But I do think God gives us the power to do such things, but we have to be open to it. We have to ask for it. With regard to the language of harm that you mentioned, I do think my understanding is that this goes back to a 20th century philosopher, Herbert Marcuse.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that Marcuse had was essentially that we have to suppress certain ideas so that there could be real freedom. Now, the question immediately arises, of course, who gets to decide which ideas you oppress? Is it Marcuse? Should his ideas be suppressed? Well, no, of course not. But this has been extremely influential, I would say, over the last 20 years. I don't think it was nearly as influential during his lifetime, but over the last 20 years, I would say it has become extremely influential. In the book, there's a really good book called The Coddling of the American Mind, and they talks a little bit about this. And it's by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they say is that along with this notion that language is violence, has come a decline in the characteristic of resilience. Mm-hmm. So we're not teaching children something that they need to thrive in the world today, which is resilience. I understand it's obvious that language can be hurtful to people. And as Christians, we want to avoid that to the extent that that's possible. And in some ways, it is inevitable that language is going to hurt people because these are very personal kinds of issues for us, whether we're talking about sexuality or end-of-life care or abortion or whatever it may be, war. These are very personal issues for many of us. And so at times we are going to hear things we don't like, and we're going to have emotional reactions to those things. But the idea that we have to shut down dialogue because language is inherently violent, I think or certain language is inherently violent, does an injustice to the nature of language. It does an injustice to what real violence is. And it inhibits intellectual progress. And in my opinion, it inhibits the common good. I'll stop there. If there's anything you want me to elaborate on, I will, but I don't want to monologue too much.
No, that's okay. But how do you think that this hurts the common good?
Because it keeps us, as you just suggested, it keeps us from having conversations that we need to have.
Mm-hmm.
For example, on transgenderism, is transgenderism an unmitigated good? Or under what the questions that we should ask is, first of all, is this a good to begin with? And secondly, if it is a good to begin with, under what circumstances is it a good? And what is the appropriate way to approach it?
Mm-hmm.
And all these ideas get mixed together in sort of the muddle of online debate. Issues from having compassion for people with gender dysphoria to puberty blockers for minors, and we need to sort through these matters and think through them from a Christian perspective so that we can figure out what our church's position. Churches need to do this work. Churches need to do this work. They need groups of people who do this work on their behalf, who will then bring these back to our general conferences, general assemblies, whatever they may be, so that we can ratify them. The churches need to do this work because these are complex issues. It's not really deniable that some people experience gender dysphoria. They feel like they're born the wrong sex.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the Christian response to that? That's the question. How do we think about this as Christians, and how do we respond to this as Christians?
What do you think is, and how, especially in this day and age, and you brought up in your essay some talk about Charles Taylor, and which then led me to think about Andrew Root, who has also drawn a lot of his work from Charles Taylor, and kind of living in an age that we do that is very secular. How do we kind of create communities that really offer and can have space for the transcendent when we're thinking about these issues? Because I think it is so easy to kind of live in the world that we live in and use the language of business, or use the language, especially increasingly, of politics, and think that we're being Christian when, well, no, we're just kind of using whatever is the political
right.
kind of
we're
ideology.
Outsourcing our ethics. We're outsourcing our ethics to political parties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why are we doing that? Why are we allowing ourselves to outsource that to political parties, regardless on the left or the right?
So, it's interesting you mentioned Charles Taylor's work, because the book is called A Secular Age, but I've always thought that's a little bit of a misnomer, because what he describes in the book, after sort of the collapse of the Christian worldview monopoly in the West,
mm-hmm.
is what he calls the Nova effect. The Nova effect is it's not just that people stopped being Christian and started being atheists, okay? It's that there was kind of an explosion, and now there was this new galaxy of options available to people in the West. So you could be an agnostic, you could be an atheist, you could be a liberal Christian, you could be a conservative Christian, you could be Wiccan, you could be neo-pagan, Buddhist, whatever it is that whatever option appeals to you is something is now an option, is like a real live option for you. So this notion of the Nova effect, I think, is very significant. In the face of the Nova effect, I'm not sure, and I can't really blame churches for this, but we haven't really known how to respond. And I think at the height of the ecumenical movement, and Vatican II came out of this, idea. The notion is, let's just kind of sand all the rough edges off of our traditions. Let's diminish the particularity of our traditions as much as possible, and let's call that ecumenism. Okay, so let's just go for the least common denominator. Well, when you're doing that, you're not really going to think in particularly Christian ways about these kinds of issues.
Mm.
And it just opens the door for rank pragmatism, for things like, and I'm not against business models. What I'm against are business models as kind of your first move. Your first move as a Christian needs to be theological, and then there may be elements from the secular culture that can be helpful to us in churches. Okay. Rather than sanding off all the rough edges of our tradition, rather than moving to the lowest common denominator, I think a better ecumenism for Christians is one rooted in the church's creedal tradition. Here is a robust vision of God that we can all agree upon. God is one God in three persons, who became incarnate in Jesus Christ, who died for our sins and after 3 days rose from the dead. That's your starting point as a Christian, because that's what the church has always confessed. I know that there have been, groups throughout Christian history that had heterodox takes on these matters. But by and large, that is the faith that Vincent of Lerins talked about, the faith that has been confessed always, everywhere, and by all. And that is that faith. It's the Nicene Chalcedonian faith. And I think that would be a good starting point for ecumenism. Here's where we agree. We confess this vision of God. Now, we may disagree on a whole host of other things. We may disagree on church governance. We may disagree on matters related to ordination and who can be ordained and who can't be ordained. But we agree on this. And once we find that point of agreement, then we can work forward towards a common good. We know where we can cooperate and where we're probably not going to cooperate, and we can move on from there. But I think the absence of that theological center has been really bad for the churches. It's been bad for Methodists of all kinds. It's been bad for the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, if you just listen to Bishop Robert Barron talks about these things, he describes the Catholicism of his youth as a kind of beige Catholicism. Not particularly interesting. Certainly not a robust vision of Catholic life. Now, I don't agree with everything in the Roman Catholic Church, certainly, but I think Roman Catholics should be Catholic, and I think Methodists should be Methodist, and Congregationalists should be Congregationalists. And so, because we haven't done that work, that theological work of establishing ourselves in the great tradition of Christian faith, I think that's cost us, and I think that has opened the door to certain real vulnerabilities.
So that leads to a kind of a question about the particularity of Christianity, and especially of the different parts of Christianity, because there seems to be a fear of that sense of particularity. Why? I mean, why? What is it that doesn't make us want to be Christian, or to have that kind of Christian mind? Is it?
That's a great question, and I'd be interested if you have insights on this. I think part of it is we don't want to be seen as reactionary. We don't want to be seen as kind of fundamentalistic. I'm really not sure. What do you think about that question, Dennis?
I think I think you're kind of on the right track. I think, one of the things that I have heard a lot in my years is, we don't want to be dogmatic. And I think we think that to have sense of dogma or to have any sense of type of belief is to be narrow-minded. It's to be that you really just don't think about things. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I mean, it can be. I think that there are lots of people that are stuck in this is the way it is, and can be very fundamentalist in their opinions and beliefs. But I tend to see those things kind of like the historic creeds, less as a wall, and kind of like a boundary. Like, if you're playing football or soccer or something, that, you have to play that within the bounds of that.
Right.
And
Right.
within the bounds of that, there's a lot of freedom. I mean, you're, playing all over the place, but there is a certain boundary that can define who you are. And
Right.
so I see that dogma as definition. I don't see it as a way of me not thinking, because of, but I think the common way that we look at things is that to have these kind of central beliefs is to be unthinking. And to me, I think it's actually the other way around. When you don't have those, you kind of just kind of pick up whatever the flavor of the month. And
Well, because everyone is dogmatic about something.
exactly,
We just may
are.
not realize what it is. We probably don't realize our own dogmatism.
Mhm.
I remember when I was a grad student, I went to a lecture, and there were some people from a nearby university, some professors from a nearby university who had come by, and I don't even remember the topic of the lecture, but one of them was this kind of postmodernist guy, and he was talking about absolute claims and how terrible absolute claims are. And when people start making absolute claims, you better look out, because that's when the danger really happens. And someone who was at the lecture asked him, "Is that an absolute claim?" And of course, that was one of my former teachers, Billy Abraham, and of course the person that he asked the question to was flummoxed by this. He apparently had never thought about this question before. He looked like kind of like, when a dog hears a siren and kind of turns its head sideways
Mhm.
like that.
Yeah.
And he said no. And then someone else in the room said, "Well, then it doesn't mean anything." So, he was actually making absolute claims. He just didn't realize it at the time. Everybody is dogmatic about something. The question is, what are you going to be dogmatic about? What are going to be the presuppositions that you're going to begin discourse with? And I think for Christians, one of our presuppositions has to be the vision of God that has been handed over to us through the historic church. We can
Mhm.
disagree about a lot of things. We cannot disagree about that. I think that is just an essential component of Christian belief.
In your essay, you talk a little bit about your worry about how some churches have adopted illiberal beliefs. And
Yeah.
you've talked a little bit about how really the Christian mind and all this is really part of the whole tradition of classical liberalism. What are some ways that you think that churches, denominations have adopted illiberal kind of beliefs? And what has that done? How has that affected the church's witness?
Well, for example, you mentioned in your tradition the lack of discussion around transgenderism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I have seen similar things happen recently in my former tradition of the United Methodist Church. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It can also happen on the conservative side quite
Mm-hmm.
easily.
Yeah.
I think some of what's happened in the Southern Baptist Convention recently
Yeah.
has been illiberal, and many of them would probably own that label proudly. Not all of them. Okay, so I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush. Um, but it is very easy for it is very easy for us to become moral absolutists and to refuse to entertain ideas with which we may disagree. I have strong convictions, you have strong convictions. I don't doubt that, and I respect that, actually. I want Christians to have strong convictions about things. But at the same time, I think we also have to have intellectual virtue, and we have to avoid intellectual vice. And intellectual virtue involves things like listening, coherence, just simply using good judgment on things, empathy. We can still end up disagreeing with people, but that doesn't. But first, we will have had to consider their perspectives from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be able to articulate their positions as well as they would articulate their positions in a way that they could agree with.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and only then, I think, have we really understood where they're coming from. Okay. Doesn't mean we end up agreeing with them. It does mean that we have given due consideration, real thought, done the intellectual work necessary to understand where they're coming from. And out of that, we can make intellectual progress. It was John Henry Newman, I think, who said there are some things that can only be said after other things have been said.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that we have to listen to other positions. We have to give real consideration to other positions. And then, and only then, can we really make intellectual progress.
Where do you think, basically, I guess, as a society, as we are kind of dealing with trying to think Christianly, and you mentioned what was going on within the Southern Baptists, because that's another kind of controversy that's also been a problem. How and where do you think that we're headed as a church, and I guess the Big C church, in the next 5 to 10 years, as we are grappling with all of these different issues, all these different changes in society, but yet it doesn't seem that there is a willingness to engage the other.
I fear where we're going is to a place of greater entrenchment. And that's not healthy, and I don't think that serves the common good, and I don't think that's a particularly helpful witness. What I mean by entrenchment is sort of a refusal to engage. At one level, what the Southern Baptists do is none of my business. I'm not a Southern Baptist. And if the Southern Baptists make the decision through their processes of governance that they will not ordain women, they can do that. And nobody has to be a Southern Baptist. Now, I recognize that there are people who really got hurt in this. There are people who are treated badly in this. There are places where people's language has been uncharitable and unchristian about these matters. Okay, so I get, the interpersonal dynamics that are at play in all of this. When we have these controversies in the church, they can be extremely painful. When churches are disfellowshipped, that is extremely painful. But at the same time, there are going to be churches that organize their lives in ways that I disagree with or that you disagree with. That's just a fact. Okay. And so I think we make decisions. Do I want to be a Southern Baptist? Well, in light of X decision, the answer is either yes or no. And if I can't be a Southern Baptist anymore, if my convictions are so strong that I can't do that anymore, then I need to find a different faith community to affiliate with.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's sometimes easier said than done. Moving faith communities is very difficult. I've done that. You've done that. It's painful, and you lose friendships and these kinds of things. But if these are really matters of conviction, then we do these things. But what I fear is that within Christian communities, we're going to develop these bunker mentalities And that's going to prevent us from doing the kind of intellectual and ecumenical work that we need to do. If you've been through the church wars, and you have, and I have, the United Methodist Church right now is in the midst of a very bitter divide. There's enough blame to go around in this regard. I have my own opinions about why this happened, but I'll set those aside for the moment. If you've been through the church wars, it's very easy to develop a kind of bunker mentality. It's very easy to let your scars define you, and those scars define not only you as a person, but how you engage other people in the public square. You mentioned forgiveness earlier, and I think there has to be that. Once we get on the other side of this, there has to be forgiveness. And to the extent that we can, there has to be reconciliation. We had to forgive each other. None of us is completely blameless in any of this. And so, and Christ tells us to, Christ doesn't make it optional for us to forgive, right? He doesn't make it optional. He doesn't say, love your enemies unless your enemies are just really, really bad, unless they're real jerks. Forgive other people unless they've really been out of line, then you don't have to. That's not the command. So we have to figure out ways to do that and to begin to talk with one another, work with one another, and love one another.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've come to realize over the years is how much we want to make. Well, one, I think what we don't realize is how hard it is to be a Christian.
Yeah.
That it really, I keep always going back to the whole concept of the scandal of the cross or the offensiveness. And that what Christ sometimes calls us to do is rather offensive to our sensibilities. And so I think we want to try to make our faith amenable to us. And, when we do that, I think we miss out a lot, and I don't think that we realize this is a hard thing to do, is to follow Christ. It's not just something, it's not simply adapting a political posture, which right. I think sometimes we think that we've made it out to be that in some ways.
Or to go chasing after respectability, right? Christ said, everyone will hate you because of me. I mean, that's pretty strong language. Now, he said that to his first followers, and so our context may be different from theirs. But if we're not getting any pushback from the world around us that doesn't know Christ, then we're probably not saying anything of significance. It's okay not to be liked by the wider culture. In fact, it's something really that we should suspect is going to happen. It's okay to be different. I have good friends in the Cuban Methodist Church. That is a culture that, it's a communist nation. And a lot of the culture is very, very unfriendly to the kind of Christianity that they practice, which is a form of kind of evangelical Pentecostalish Methodism. And they live with that all the time, right? They understand themselves by necessity as a counterculture within that world, as an alternative to the way the rest of the world lives around them. If we're not willing to do that, then we're not going to get very far. People don't want the same thing from church that they get from MSNBC or Fox News on a Sunday morning, and I think that's why so many traditions are declining. We're not saying anything unique. We're not saying anything particular. We're not giving anyone a different vision of life and challenging them to live into it. Having a Christian mind is going to force us to do that. And I want to be the first to say I don't have this thing mastered. I don't see my own mind as being entirely Christian. I mean, I wrestle with sin like everyone else. I wrestle with big questions like everyone else. And so I what I'm suggesting to you on my own behalf is aspirational. I mean, I'm trying to get there with God's help. But I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Well, kind of as we conclude here, I wanted to give you the opportunity of, if people wanted to know more about you, or to read up more things about you, or to read up about Firebrand, where should they go?
Yeah, thank you for that. Firebrand you can access at firebrandmag.com. We're on Twitter as well. Unfortunately, Matt Gaetz also there's a Firebrand podcast, but Matt Gaetz also has, we did not know this, has a podcast called Firebrand. So we're not Matt Gaetz, just to let everyone know. But there's firebrandtalk.com, or excuse me, at Firebrand Talk. That's our Twitter handle for the podcast. And you can check out United Theological Seminary, where I serve as academic dean, at www.united.edu. So thank you. Thanks. I'm on Twitter at UTSDoc.
All right.
Thanks, Dennis.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast and to have this really, I think, enlightening discussion, and hope to have you back on again soon.
Thank you. I'd like that. And I appreciate the opportunity, Dennis. Keep up the good work.
All right. Take care.
God bless.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed this episode with David Watson. There are going to be links to his podcast, links to his article, links to the book, The Christian Mind by Harry Balmers, available. I've also put in there a link to an article by a recent guest, Amar Peterman, that he talks about apologetics and why he is done doing that. I thought that it was an interesting, I don't know if I want to say counterpoint, but it's an interesting viewpoint, kind of about what does it mean to think Christianly, Christian thinking, and thought I might want to put that in there. Read the article and let me know what you think. You can always drop me a line. You can either respond to the link if you're on Substack. There is a place to leave comments. You can also send me an email at Church and Main, all one word, at substack.com. Also, just to let you know, could please consider subscribing. You can subscribe to your favorite podcast app. You can also subscribe on Substack by going to the page, Church and Main, all one word, .substack.com. And you can go there and subscribe and receive the latest episode either on the Substack app or in your email inbox. You can also subscribe on the website for Church and Main, which is churchandmain, all one word, .org. And in either place, you can also consider leaving a donation if you would like. Just to let you know that some of the upcoming episodes the schedule might be a little wonky, and I want to let you know why. A few weeks ago, now a week and a half ago, my mother had a stroke, and luckily she is doing much better.
She was discharged from the hospital yesterday and is now in rehab. She did. Her speech was a bit garbled, and she kind of lost some, as they call, neglect, or had some neglect on her left side. Those are both improving, and hopefully will continue to improve with more rehab. But as any of you might know, if you've had to deal with kind of a family crisis, things have been rather busy. Spending time at the hospital in St. Paul, and then working of getting her a place for rehab, where she'll be for the next few weeks, and just trying to figure life out. So it's just been a busy time for myself and for my husband. So prayers are always welcomed. Continue prayers for my mother as she is healing. And but I just wanted to explain why things might be a little bit wonky. Usually I try to get these episodes up on Mondays. And that has been a little bit difficult because you're doing that, you're juggling work. And I'm bivocational, so I'm doing 2 jobs and also then trying to look after mom. So that's kind of where things are at right now. But I will work on trying to get these episodes up and running. And we do have a few more episodes coming up in the near future. And if you can, please share this podcast with a friend or a family member, and let them know about and help to spread the news about Church in Maine. So that is it for this episode. This is episode 150 of Church in Maine. My name is Dennis Sanders. I'm your host. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you all very soon.